Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Nasia Hadjigeorgiou. I'm an assistant professor in transitional justice and human rights at UCLan Cyprus. This is a webinar on human trafficking and the buffer zone in Cyprus. It's designed to answer a few key questions about what is happening in terms of human trafficking and what are the factors that are affecting human trafficking in Cyprus. In particular, it will be focusing on the role of the buffer zone and therefore the role of the Cyprus problem to the phenomenon that we call human trafficking. I would like to start from the outset by giving you an overview, for those of you who are not familiar with it, of the island of Cyprus. This is going to be very brief. Cyprus is currently divided into two parts, a de jure and a de facto state. In other words, the areas that are under the effective control of the Republic of Cyprus, on the map shown in pink, and the areas that are not under the effective control of the Republic of Cyprus and that remain under the effective control of Turkey, that appear on the map as red. The blue part of the map is the buffer zone. That is the part of the island that is administered by the United Nations, and I will talk about the buffer zone in a bit more detail later on, while the two green parts are the sovereign base areas. These are two parts of the island of Cyprus that constitute about 3% of the island that are under the sovereignty of the United Kingdom and have been under the sovereignty of the United Kingdom since 1960, since independence, in other words. So if we start with the basics, what is the buffer zone? What is the green line in Cyprus? As I explained in the map before, it's a line basically that spans the island of Cyprus and separates the areas that are under the effective control from the areas that are not under the effective control of the Republic of Cyprus. It is about 180 kilometers long, and it is the line that was established when the two armies, the Turkish army and the Republic of Cyprus army, stopped fighting on the 16th of August 1974. While the map creates an impression of a line that is unmovable, that is in fact not the case. The line is not as stable as one might imagine, and there have been attempts, and the attempts are in fact ongoing. So there have been attempts over the years to move it in one direction or another. So a meter 1 year, a second meter another year, basically as a way of increasing one of the two sides' control of the island. So if you go back to the map, the buffer zone can be either very narrow. So if you look at the Nicosia part of the map, the line between the two sides is literally just a few meters across, or it can be very very wide. So if you go back to the map, if you look at the Larnaca part of the buffer zone, that is where the island, the village of Pila is found. They are literally a whole village fits within the buffer zone. So parts of the buffer zone are inhabited, like the village of Pila I have already mentioned, and other parts are entirely untouched and have been entirely untouched by human activity since 1974. So that is the buffer zone in terms of describing what it actually looks like. What is its legal status? Well, the problem with defining the legal status of the buffer zone is that it's not very clear, because not every side agrees on what it actually is, legally speaking. If we start with the Republic of Cyprus, the position of the Republic of Cyprus is that the buffer zone is in its jurisdiction. In short, the buffer zone does not have a special legal status, and it is part of the Republic of Cyprus territory. The Republic of Cyprus uses examples like the fact that several officials operate within the buffer zone without there being any problem. People who live in the Republic of Cyprus and are Greek Cypriots pay their taxes to the Republic of Cyprus. Generally speaking, the Republic of Cyprus claims that it is behaving in the buffer zone in exactly the same way as it is behaving in areas that are under its effective control elsewhere. On the other hand, the United Nations position is different to the Republic of Cyprus, even though this hasn't been expressly stated in this much. Oh, hello. So even though it hasn't been expressly stated in this much detail by the United Nations, in the past, the understanding is that the United Nations has effective control of the buffer zone, and in order for something to happen in the buffer zone, the United Nations itself must grant authorization. This is in direct contrast to what the Republic of Cyprus is claiming. It hasn't been, this is not a debate that has attracted much attention in the media. One would imagine that that is on purpose. So the Republic of Cyprus does not want to antagonize the United Nations, and the United Nations does not want to antagonize the Republic of Cyprus. So the fact that there is this disagreement is kept on the low. Now, with regards to the Turkish Cypriots and what they believe, this is even less clear. As far as I know, there hasn't been an official and publicly available statement from Turkish Cypriots as to what the buffer zone is, but my unofficial understanding is that they are in agreement with the United Nations. So the main question that one has to ask is, what is the impact of the Green Line on human trafficking? In other words, you have an island, it's divided into two. There is this line that is administered by the United Nations between the two parts. One of the two parts is a recognized state, a member of the European Union, a member of the international community, and the other is not. What is the impact of that line on the phenomenon of human trafficking? Before I actually outline the impact of the Green Line, I would like to just give you some basic numbers just to understand the severity of the problem of human trafficking on the island. In 2017 to 2018, the European Union issued some statistics about the number of presumed and actual human trafficking victims per 100,000 people in all EU countries. The reason I'm citing 2017 and 2018 statistics in 2021 is because there haven't been new statistics on this since. So with these statistics in mind, the European Union concluded that of all the European Union member states, Cyprus is by far in the worst position. It estimated that Cyprus has 168 presumed or actual human trafficking victims per 100,000 people. The second country on the list was the United Kingdom, which had 90 presumed or actual human trafficking victims. Cyprus has almost twice as many victims as the second highest country in the European Union. So what is with this statistic in mind, which should point to the obvious that the human trafficking problem is massively compromising quality of lives, it's massively impacting people on the island. What is the role of the Green Line on this? So undoubtedly, the impact of the Green Line has been a very negative one. I have identified 4 reasons for that. First, it hides the problem. Because there is well, a lack of communication and a total lack of cooperation between the Republic of Cyprus on the one hand and the de facto Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus on the other hand, we don't know how much human trafficking takes place. That is why I talked before about the number of presumed, actual, and that's why I spoke before about the number of estimated actual and presumed human trafficking victims on the island. So because people often arrive to the island of Cyprus through the north of the island, in other words, through the TRNC, and then irregularly cross to the Republic of Cyprus through the buffer zone, we don't have a very clear idea of how many people actually land on the island in this way and how many people cross the Green Line and get to the Republic of Cyprus in this way, and what happens to them in the north and what happens to them in the south. All of these really basic answers to really basic questions are black holes. So the very presence of the Cyprus problem hides the problem of human trafficking. The second way in which the Green Line creates a negative impact on human trafficking is that it exacerbates the problem. Why does it exacerbate the problem? Because the buffer zone is essentially unpoliced. The Republic of Cyprus is not policing the buffer zone. The TRNC is not policing the buffer zone. The United Nations Police Force is theoretically policing the buffer zone, but it has very limited jurisdictional powers as to what it can and what it cannot do. So because the buffer zone is not policed in the same way that the rest of the island is policed, it creates perfect conditions for criminality. At the same time, the fact that there is one police on one side of the island and another police on the other side of the island, and the two police forces are refusing to talk to each other to a large extent. I mean, they are conversing in very specific forums, well, the most well-known among them being the Joint Communications Room, but for all intents and purposes, communication between the two police forces is extremely limited, and communication between the two police forces for human trafficking cases is totally absent. So this lack of communication between the two police forces means that criminals who don't have the same problems communicating with each other can continue their operations without much interference from the two sides. The third way in which the Green Line and consequently the Cyprus problem is impacting human trafficking, and it's impacting human trafficking in a negative way, is because the Cyprus problem is absorbing resources, it's absorbing attention, it's absorbing any kind of civil society focus. The Republic of Cyprus is mostly concerned with resolving or talking about resolving the Cyprus problem, the TRNC the same, and because all their attention is focused on the Cyprus problem, all the other problems that we have on the island are almost entirely ignored. This is not just a side effect that has an impact on human trafficking. It is a side effect that has an impact on many other important issues, like environmental policies, like policies that have to do with women's rights, like policies that have to do with migration, and so on and so forth. The final way in which the Green Line and consequently the Cyprus problem is impacting human trafficking is the following. The Cyprus problem frames the problem of human trafficking in very problematic terms. So the Republic of Cyprus presents human trafficking as an issue of national security. It is basically saying all these irregular migrants that are arriving on the island of Cyprus are creating demographic problems for us. They are foreigners that are being sent to the island by Turkey. Multiple ministers have referred to the numbers of irregular migrants on the island as being so high that they constitute another invasion by Turkey. So all of these securitizing talk, all of these framing as these irregular migrants coming to threaten us, coming to harm us, coming to take over our land in the same way that Turkey did all those years ago. So by framing the problem in these terms, the victims of human trafficking are not understood and are not treated as victims. They are treated as perpetrators. And that, of course, means that they're not receiving the safeguards that they should be receiving. They're not receiving the protection that they should be receiving. They're not receiving the empathy they should be receiving from the authorities or from the people they come into contact with. So the next question that I want to focus on is, what do we mean by determinants of anti-trafficking efforts? Now, before I actually go on to define what we mean by determinants, I would like to mention that I was involved back in 2021, early 2021, I was involved together with 3 colleagues, Dr. Dimitra Loizou, Vezile Osum, and Andrea Manoli, together with myself, Nasia Hadjigeorgiou. We were involved in drafting a report for the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. The project that the British Institute was working on, and which we were asked to contribute to, focused on determinants of anti-trafficking efforts, and was funded by the United States government. So basically what the project was about was an attempt to understand the factors that are influencing governments to adopt or to not adopt measures that respond to human trafficking. So the official definition of determinants of anti-trafficking efforts are the factors that affect, whether positively or negatively, efforts to address anti-trafficking. The reason that we need to be focusing on the factors that shape our efforts to respond to trafficking is because if we understand those factors, if we understand the background conditions that affect our responses to human trafficking, then our responses to human trafficking can be improved. Let me give you a few examples of what we mean by determinants, just so you get an idea. So the first thing that affects whether a country is going to respond to human trafficking or not is political will. Now, political will is a term that is quite broad. It's an umbrella term, and underneath it, we include a number of things. So the first one would be resourcing. In other words, does the government provide enough money to actually put in place policies that respond to human trafficking? Capacity. In addition to the money, do officials of this government have the know-how, have the understanding to properly implement the strategies that have been articulated? Corruption. So in addition to having the know-how, are the officials operating in a way that works in good faith for responding to human trafficking, or are they receiving money from criminal networks and are therefore corrupt? The effectiveness of the government. So this is a quite broad factor that has to do with how quickly does the government respond to certain things, what is happening within government in terms of communication between different departments, Now, this is important because human trafficking is not a concern only of the police. It's not a concern only of the prosecution. It involves welfare services. It involves psychologists. If underage people are trafficked, it involves relevant services that have to do with minors, and so on and so forth. So if the government is generally ineffective, if there is not very good communication between different government departments, even if the intentions are good, it's unlikely that we will manage to respond to human trafficking effectively. The final thing that falls under political will is gender representation in political institutions. In other words, how many women are there in policymaking bodies, either that is parliament, either that is the executive, either that is the prosecution, or the judges that actually hear the case. Especially for the legislature, so for parliament, research suggests that it is women, members of parliament, who are likely to bring the matters of human trafficking to the forefront. This has also been confirmed in research that we undertook on Cyprus, where it is almost exclusively women who bring, who discuss these things in parliament. So political will is definitely a super important factor when determining whether a country is likely to adequately respond to trafficking. Another factor is economic conditions. It makes a difference if the country is a developed country, is rich, it has resources to provide to the fighting of trafficking, or if it doesn't have all these luxuries. The third, and this is quite important for Cyprus, are international standards. In other words, to what extent is international law, either in the form of treaties or in the form of reporting obligations, or through case law in international courts, to what extent is international law exerting pressure on a country to fix things? Now, Cyprus is particularly interesting in terms of international standards because it offers essentially a natural experiment. You have an island that is divided in two, and one island is internationally recognized, and it is subject to international pressure to improve its human trafficking record. And the other part of the island is not internationally recognized, and therefore it is not subject to the same pressure. And the difference between the two parts is striking, which suggests that international pressure actually plays a very important role in shaping a country's response to human trafficking. The fourth factor that plays a role is domestic case law, in other words, cases that are heard in national courts. The fifth factor, and again, this is of interest to Cyprus, and we will discuss it later on, is the role of civil society. So to what extent are non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, to what extent are they pushing for improvements in the law or for improvements in the way the law is being implemented? The sixth factor has to do with media exposure. To what extent is human trafficking something that the media is concerned with? Again, Cyprus had a few examples of media exposure of human trafficking. When in 2019 we had a serial killer in Cyprus, kidnapping and killing irregular migrants or even regular migrants, but definitely non-Cypriots. The media briefly took interest in the conditions that many migrants are living in. Finally, ad hoc events and crises can play a role. For example, it has been reported in the literature that very big sports events play a role, both positive and negative, in the way migrants are treated or humans are being trafficked from one country to the other. So having established what we mean by determinants of anti-trafficking efforts, what are the determinants in the Republic of Cyprus? So what are the factors that are pushing Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus, to respond to human trafficking? Well, the main positive determinant of anti-trafficking efforts in the Republic of Cyprus is international pressure. And international pressure is exerted for the improvement of both the letter of the law and for the improvement of the application of the law. So the Trafficking in Persons report that is published by the US government every year, in 2021, labeled the Republic of Cyprus as a tier 2 country. This is a 3-tier system. In other words, the top performing countries that are doing the best in terms of responding to human trafficking are labeled as tier 1. Medium countries are labeled as tier 2, and countries that require significant improvements are labeled as tier 3. The Republic of Cyprus over the last years has been somewhere between tier 1 and tier 2 countries. In 2021, it dropped from a tier 1 to a tier 2 country. And the reason the US government offered for this is because while the law is in place, and looks good, just in 2019, we had yet another amendment to the law that increased penalties for human trafficking perpetrators, for example. So while the law is in place and it does look good on paper, in practice, we aren't really seeing that many cases reach the courts on human trafficking charges. So this is one example in which international pressure in the form of reporting has pushed the Republic of Cyprus to improve its responses to human trafficking. Another example in the Republic of Cyprus would be the fact that several years ago now, in a case called Ranchev and Russia and Cyprus, the European Court of Human Rights found Cyprus to be in violation of freedom of the right to be free from slavery, because its law and its application of the law did not protect women from being trafficked as prostitutes on the island. So because of that case, which is another example of international pressure, the Republic of Cyprus responded to the criticism and amended its legislation accordingly. Other likely positive determinants, such as pressure from civil society, lobbying from civil society, domestic case law, they have had a limited effect. Especially as non-governmental organizations in the Republic were found to be generally disempowered and marginalized. Now, the reason that I am pausing here and stressing this as an important finding is because this is very different to what is happening in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, in the de facto state of the island, the TRNC, where civil society has been extremely impactful in shaping the response to human trafficking. So that we are seeing a very big difference between the two parts of the island here as well. Having mentioned the areas that are not under the effective control of the Republic of Cyprus, so the TRNC, what are the determinants there? So in the TRNC, as I mentioned before, international pressure is either non-existent or it is felt very indirectly, and therefore it has not had a great impact in shaping things. The job typically done by the international community has been taken over by local civil society organizations, which are, as I mentioned before, again, much more vibrant, much more active, and much more impactful than those in the Republic of Cyprus. Now, so it appears, if you take the two parts of the island together, it appears that by far the most impactful determinant in the Republic of Cyprus is international pressure, and by far the most powerful, impactful determinant in the TRNC is civil society, but that should not give the impression that the two determinants, international pressure and civil society, are equally powerful. Why do I say that? Because while the Republic of Cyprus, with its many flaws, has been ranked as a tier 1 or a tier 2 country, the TRNC has been ranked by the same reports, the United States Trafficking in Persons report, has been ranked as a very worrying tier 3 country. So while changes are taking place in the TRNC, the most notable change is the fact that finally in 2020, the crime of human trafficking was created. So while some changes have taken place, and while these changes are wholly because of civil society pressure, the TRNC is far behind in terms of its human trafficking responses compared to the Republic of Cyprus. So positive determinants have been identified for both parts of the island, but it is clear that international pressure is a much more impactful positive determinant than civil society. Negative determinants in both the Republic of Cyprus and in the TRNC include political unwillingness and the political inability of the authorities to effectively fight human trafficking. It's not very clear why there is political unwillingness. One factor undoubtedly is the Cyprus problem, as I mentioned before. The Cyprus problem detracts attention and resources from politicians. So politicians are simply not that interested in human trafficking because they are concerned with the Cyprus problem instead. We also have an inability of the authorities to effectively fight human trafficking. That is because on both parts of the island we have not very effective government structures, especially in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, but to a lesser extent in the Republic as well. We have corruption, and one should note that human trafficking plays a big part in the economy of both the de facto and the de jure state. So there are many individuals who are working in the construction sectors, in the agriculture sector, in the entertainment sector, if you want to call nightclubs that, who are being trafficked, and they are making the owners of these cabarets or farms or developing companies a lot of money. So the last question remains is what can be done to improve the situation? What are the recommendations that flow from our research? Well, the first problem clearly has to be the first recommendation, clearly has to be the fact that resolving the Cyprus problem would really go a long way towards improving things. If the Cyprus problem is resolved, or this lack of clarity about what is happening on the other side would be drastically removed. All this lack of willingness to cooperate with the other side would also go away, and all this attention that the Cyprus problem is receiving would diminish, at least to a certain extent. However, the Cyprus problem has been here for a long time, and it is likely to remain here for an even longer time. So what do we do in the meantime? Well, in the meantime, we have to acquire a better understanding of the problem so that we can more effectively address it. We have to do more research in order to understand where human trafficking victims are coming from, what is pulling them to Cyprus, or what is pushing them to Cyprus. Who are they? How old are they? What gender do they have? What were they doing in their home countries? What are they doing in Cyprus now? Are there people who are managing to escape being trafficked on the island, and how do they do that? All this basic profiling that is going to help shape policies to respond to human trafficking victims is at the moment not being done. and it should be a priority. The second thing that needs to happen is we need to start educating our public. We need to start explaining that human trafficking victims are victims. They are not perpetrators. They're not here to harm us. To the contrary, often without us wanting to, we are harming them. With this in mind, I would like to thank you. The last two slides are contain some key sources. I'm just quickly going to go through them. The first one is the report that I have been mentioning, that was drafted by myself, Dr. Loizou, Misosum, and Ms. Manoli, Determinants of Anti-Trafficking Efforts, Cyprus case study that was published by the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. Then we have an EU document with some key statistics. Then we have the Greta report that provides some key information from 2020 on human trafficking. We have the US State Department Trafficking in Persons report. I mentioned this a couple of times in the presentation. And then we have a document called Mapping Out the Situation of Labor Trafficking in Cyprus from 2014 from a Greek Cypriot and a Turkish Cypriot civil society organization. Then we have two publications by myself. One is called The Invisible Impact of Frozen Conflicts, that looks at human trafficking of foreign domestic workers in Cyprus, and another is a publication that I had with the Ombudsman of the Republic of Cyprus on the status of foreign domestic workers in Cyprus, that draws conclusions from a very big empirical study we conducted. Finally, a few more of my publications. So a policy paper that I published with the LSE, the London School of Economics, Hellenic Observatory, and the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, on foreign domestic workers, again, called Helping Those That Help Us, and a podcast I created with Fiona Mullen in 2021 on irregular migrants in Cyprus. Then we have a Turkish Cypriot publication from 2012 on migrant women workers in Cyprus and how they're being exploited in nightclubs. We have an ombudsman report from 2019 on victims of trafficking in Cyprus, in the Republic of Cyprus. And finally, we have a Turkish publication. This ombudsman publication, by the way, is in Greek. And finally, we have a publication in Turkish as well on a similar issue. With that in mind, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to this presentation on human trafficking in Cyprus. Thank you very much.